Thank you again for coming out tonight. I'm thrilled to discuss the many women that assisted in helping drying out our nasty swamp town, which essentially means promoting temperance in our very boozy hometown of Chicago. Now, when it came to this topic, I found it helpful to contextualize alcohol in America and how it got here. So the Puritans, they brought the beer with them, more beer than water, but it was also safer to drink. Important to keep that in mind. And since alcohol at the time was part of most folks' daily diet, for example, a light beer at breakfast, a medium beer, I don't know, a stronger beer at lunch, and then wine at dinner, a little tipple before bed, people's tolerances were crazy. They could throw them back. In fact, they threw them back so much that in the mid-1800s, the average American was consuming 7 gallons of alcohol annually. I'm going to put that into an additional context. Since Prohibition, we've oscillated around 2 gallons on average per person annually, which comes out to about 9 drinks a week. Depending on the type of drink and how quickly they're drunk, that can count as an alcohol addiction from certain medical definitions. So let's imagine what 7 gallons looks like, shall we? Let's stick there. Unfortunately, with all of this, alcoholism or alcohol addiction was prevalent and is today. And especially with that era where we're drinking 7 gallons annually, it could be really detrimental. It is a disease, and especially if this disease hit the husband of the household, his family could very well be impacted as well. Because in that mid-1800s time frame, the women didn't really have the wives didn't have the same opportunities or abilities to support their families like men. So if a man suffered from alcohol addiction and, let's say, lost his job, or worse, turned to domestic violence, the wife and children of that man, they were left without much to do besides suffer. The community resources sometimes were there, especially churches played a strong role in the community, but as far as social services, opportunities for women outside of sex work, there really wasn't much, and even then, you didn't have antibiotics, so that was another risky job. So this is where we're jumping in. Let's get some more context. So, 1833 is the year Chicago incorporates as a town. 37 was the city. We're talking 33 here, folks. Had to clarify that beforehand. Anyway, so Chicago is a brand new town, and with that comes our first temperance society, and it is not the Women's Christian Temperance Union. This is 40 years before them. And in that same year, we got a city, we got a temperance society, and we got our first brewery. Lil and Diversey, y'all recognize those streets, right? Yeah, that was a brewery. Not all was jolly good times between the saloon owners and the temperance folks. The tensions were definitely rising around the country, and a very short example of that I will cover is the 1855 lager beer riots. The caveat, folks, this could be its whole own lecture. I'm actually surprised we didn't have this as a lecture, Patty, but that's cool. That's fine. So next year, thank you, Giovanna. So the very, very quick, high overview of the lager beer riots of 1855 is that we had a ton of German and Irish immigrants opening saloons and making buck. They are making tons and tons of money. It's great. Here's the thing, though. On the Illinois law books, there was an ordinance saying, or a law saying you couldn't sell beer, alcohol, on Sundays. Chicago has chosen to enforce that selectively while it was part of the Illinois law books. So the Temperance organization, which was tight with the police force, both mostly Protestant, were like, these Catholic, Irish, and Germans are trying to sell beer on Sunday. Yeah, pull out your vapor salts. Yeah, but you know who they're catering to in these saloons? That they're men who only have a day off on Sunday. They're working the remaining 6 days of the week. So tensions are high. And they came to the Lager beer riots. Essentially talks about when the saloon keepers were confronted by the police, and it did end in violence. So I know it told it in kind of a silly way, but it was a very serious thing. So definitely lots of tensions around alcohol leading up to Prohibition. And that flows us right into 20 years later. In 1874, we have the founding of the Women Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. I'm not going to flip the C and the T at all, because I practiced. Alrighty. So the WCTU got their starts in Ohio, and it was born out of this interesting movement where women, and some children, but mostly women, would created something called the Women's Crusade, where all the way from New York State to here in Chicago, women's groups, women's religious groups were gathering in front of saloons and singing hymns to encourage those folks drinking to go home to their families, and more importantly, to convince the saloon keepers to find another business to go into, to just abandon all their years of hard work, sacrifice, investment, and not sell alcohol anymore. Something important to remember, these women couldn't vote. This was their only option, was to be persuasive, and boy, they were persuasive. Let me paint a picture for you here. Who's seen Titanic? Okay, spoiler alert. When the ship's going down, and you got the violin and the orchestra, and they're playing that song, Nearer My God to Thee, it's a hymn. Not a dry eye in the theater, not a dry eye in the saloon, because that's the song they're singing. It's very, very moving hymn if you haven't heard it. So it works. So the Women's Crusades were successful and directly led to women deciding that women need to work for themselves and uplift their sisters and start the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They did. And that same year came to Chicago. Now, to continue anchoring us along the course of what we'll be learning about tonight, important to also note that 1893 was our World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition. I will touch upon the WCTU at the fair. And then I think we could all use a reminder that the 18th Amendment prohibited the sale, distribution, and creation of alcohol. And it went into effect in 1920, passed in 1919, effect in 1920. And that essentially started Prohibition. And it only ended in 1933 when the 21st Amendment ends Prohibition. Cheers. Also, right before this lecture, like literally 10 minutes ago, found out that during that time, I had a great grandpa on the south side with his own distillery. Or no, still? It's a still? It was a still. We still have it. I'm so excited to see it. Anyway, alrighty. I would be utterly remiss if I did not mention my homegirl, Frances Willard. When I told people, oh yeah, I'm talking about the WCTU, first thing people say, oh, you're talking about Franny, right? She didn't go by Franny, but you know, Frances. So with that, Frances Willard was born in 1839, passed in 1898, and is considered the most famous of the National Women's Christian Temperance Union. She served as their second president, with her term starting in 1879, and served all the way and up until her death. She supported temperance, of course, but also women's rights, labor reform, and many other social issues. Willard came from a family that greatly valued education, especially among women, and instilled a strong sense of faith within Willard herself, specifically Methodist, but she was known to be a woman of all avenues to God, so to speak. Now, her family consisted of Willard's father and mother, an older brother, and a younger sister. Unfortunately, her father and sister passed within quick succession of each other, and her brother got married right around that time as well, leaving her mother, Mary, and Frances kind of on their own, but they were really a dynamic duo. Frances was quoted saying her mother very much was a source of strength and spiritual guidance for her throughout her life. Frances's family lived in many different places, including Janesville, Wisconsin, but they did move to Evanston, and Evanston does claim her as one of their own. And of course, it's Evanston, so we claim them too. She graduated from Northwestern Female College in 1859, and then proceeded to take a series of teaching jobs, including in a suburb we now know as River Forest. There's an elementary school out there named for her. We have a graduate of that elementary school in the room tonight. Not naming names. As a young adult, Frances was lucky enough to travel around Europe and the Middle East with her good friend, Kate Jackson, for 2.5 years. Yeah, Kate's dad paid for that. That was really nice. Anyway, so her time spent traveling really opened her eyes to the importance of education, and especially educating women, and how societies as a whole are uplifted when women are considered full and contributing members and challenged and given opportunities that the men are as well. Now, her interest specifically in women's suffrage came from the essay Women's Influence in Politics by Henry Ward Beecher. Her interest in feminism, it's a big word for the 18-somethings, was sparked by a lecture by Theodore Tilton titled The American Woman. This is specifically where she found her purpose to do all she could for women in a Christian way. Now, it's 1874 again. We're back. And Frances Willard got in on the ground floor of the WCTU by participating in women's crusades. Yeah, she was singing Nearer My God to Thee with those other gals. Go Frances. And through her involvement and experience with public speaking, she was asked to become the president of the Chicago WCTU right off the bat. So she was the first Chicago president. That's our girl. Under her leadership, the Chicago Central Union chapter, they call themselves unions, I call them chapters. You'll get it. Anyway, her union/chapter focused on social reform, including establishing kindergartens, sewing, and cooking classes for girls, also known as employable trades, and recreation and residential facilities. Also, as president of the Chicago WCTU, she traveled to the first ever meeting of the Illinois WCTU and proposed a new motto for the state. That motto being, for God and home and native land. This was quickly adopted by the WCTU. They recognized good marketing when they saw it. And not long after, the national WCTU also adopted this motto, which helped Frances gain even more recognition within the organization. This recognition led to her becoming the corresponding secretary of the WCTU. Important to note that the first president and the first round of leaders for the WCTU nationally were it's a conservative organization, but they are more conservative than Frances Willard, and absolutely refused to adopt the cause of women's suffrage. They thought a woman's place was to continue doing the women's crusades, the singing, the essentially persuasion versus exercising a legal right to vote. I agree. All righty. I think we got a hand up over here for the snacks. It's not me. But anyway, okay, I digress. Now, Frances was like, all right, you national gals, I know it's a big honor to be put here as your corresponding secretary, but if you're not down with women's suffrage, I'm not down with you. So she went back to Chicago. She stepped down from the national WCTU and maintained her local position as president and continued her good work here. One of the local campaigns she worked on, she dubbed the Home Protection Campaign, which essentially was to ask for women's right to vote on banning local alcohol ordinances. So essentially, if a vote came up saying, hey, do we want to ban alcohol in this town or during these hours, the sale of it, she wanted women to have the right to vote on those ordinances. It got her a lot of attention again. It did not succeed. Women were not voting in that time. Not allowed to vote. Anyway, but the catchy name of home protection and almost getting it through brought her back up to the top, and she snagged that presidency of the national WCTU in 1879. She's back on top. Anyway, So she brought women's suffrage into the limelight as hand-in-hand importance with temperance and prohibition for the WCTU. She also empowered, due to her vast travels, she was very much aware of the size of our country and the very diverse needs of local chapters of the WCTU. So she empowered those chapters to, they had to accept temperance, there was a bare minimum, but they could customize based on what their community needed at that time. She also expanded chapters or unions into the newly freed southern states and out to the west. She also, this was really disappointing. She's really racist. It gets worse. So WCTU was integrated. There were black chapters, but she upheld a hierarchy where a white woman would have to oversee the chapters of black members, so keeping them on an unequal footing of their white sisters. Not good. But it gets worse. This is also when the South is having Jim Crow laws and seeing an absolute surge in murder, also known as lynchings, a very, very violent, horrible thing. And so our girl Jane Addams, she was like, hey, Frances, I know your family were abolitionists, and I know you're really popular with your southern chapters. We need you to speak out against lynchings. This is absolutely horrendous. Frances Willard really had an opportunity to speak up, and she didn't, because in the same breath that she's condemning lynchings, she also justified them as a way to defend white women against black men, which is not what lynchings were about. That's a whole nother topic to get into, but that's just full stop. That's not what that was about. It was racism. So, yeah, Frances. Anyway, so on a lighter note, she did push the WCTU to be more of a socialist organization. She was raised very much middle class, and later in her tenure as president, befriended working women and realized, socialism's actually pretty good for the working class. This is really not sustainable, these working hours and the wages. So she adopted socialism and moved the WCTU away from what was then the Republican Party. That was not popular with her fellow middle-class ladies in the WCTU. So she was kind of on a little bit of rough footing. This is about the time her mother passed away, too. So Frances was she was going through it. So she was spending about 6 months out of the last 2 years of her life each year in England with her counterpart there, Lady Henry Somerset. She had her own scandals because she was trying to get the England WCTU to allow light beer and cigarettes. American WCTU was like, did you miss the memo? What's going on? Anyway, Frances still spent a lot of time over there, and that's actually where she passed away in 1898. Oh, no, it was in New York. She was about to go over there. That's important. So when she passed in 1898, despite the scandals involved in the latter half of her presidency, the WCTU came together and thoroughly mourned her and memorialized her. Through the last part of her presidency, she kicked off the creation of the Women's Temple here in Chicago. She didn't see it built, but there was an amphitheater named the Willard Amphitheater in her honor. I mentioned Willard Elementary. She was also involved with Northwestern University. There's buildings named after her there. Just very much, not a perfect figure, but a beloved figure. Now, this temple in itself has its own scandals. It was designed and built with the best intentions to be a headquarters for the WCTU, but also to offer offices to other women's groups and help them, uplift them, and help them grow as well, with the idea of helping women in the community. It was one of the last designs of John Wellborn Root and was a beautiful example of architecture. Look at those curves, those lines, those windows. You might recognize where it is at LaSalle and Monroe. If, like me, you're going to go looking for it, let me save you the disappointment. In the 1920s, it was viciously torn down and replaced with a soulless box. It's a bank building. Anyway, now, I don't know about you folks, but I chose this topic because I wanted to dig into some salacious historical tea and gossip that I could share with my friends and not hurt anybody. So shall we get into it? Yeah. Yes, I love the enthusiasm. We're going to start with the christening of the battleship Illinois. All right. Main character here is Nanny Leiter. She is the gal you can see on your screen with those big, beautiful eyes you could really get lost in. What a gal. Her name might sound familiar because her sister, Daisy Leiter, was a dollar princess, and her other sister, Mary Curzon, married the Viceroy of India. That's like the main colonizer guy. So, if you're wondering what a dollar princess is, Stephanie gave a great talk last year about dollar princesses, and it's on our Facebook. But the quick version is that there were a lot of wealthy American heiresses that shipped on over to England to get those like baroness, lady, so-and-so titles from the aristocracy. So in that way, they saved all the aristocracies from England that were actually broke. If you've seen Downton Abbey, yeah, okay. These are my people, I love this. You know Cora, the mom? Yeah, she was a dollar princess. Now, what made the Leiter girls really wealthy was their dad. His name was Levi Leiter, and he actually co-founded Marshall Fields. Yeah. So that's how they got all their wealth. And if you spend any time up in Door County, they have a fabulous house up there, and they were very involved in that community as well as Chicago. Anyway, so you can see why Nanny Leiter was a big deal. Okay, we're here. So Nanny Leiter was asked to christen the first battleship Illinois, which traditionally, christening a ship involves you take a bottle of champagne and you whack it over the bow of a ship. There's a rope involved to stop glass getting in your eyes, but it does have to include champagne. But here's the problem. The Chicago WCTU jumped in and were like, can you use water instead? Like, what if we used water? Wouldn't that be so fun and modern? Folks, sailors, then and now, are a superstitious bunch. Anyway, they don't want to change. This was very scandalous. You don't mess with the laws of the sea and the traditions, otherwise the ship goes down and everyone dies. I didn't make the rules. So anyway, the president of the Ohio WCTU, Mrs. Annie Clark, decided to weigh in by saying, "It is certainly time in this enlightened 19th century to give up the heathen customs. If sailors are so superstitious, it is time they learned better." Okay, Annie. Now, being a high society lady, Nanny Leiter did not comment on any of this directly. Absolutely not. She did spread word through her social circles, where it trickled down into the newspapers, and they said she was staying out of the fray. Even though the WCTU was responding in the same newspaper with messages such as, quote, "Water is life. Alcohol in all forms is poison." That was said by Mrs. Barker, treasurer of the National WCTU. They really were pulling in everyone they could for this. Now, folks, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I could not find a definitive answer on whether or not Nanny used champagne or not, but I do know this. The battleship Illinois had a long, successful career spanning over 50 years. So I'm going to assume Nanny took that bottle of Veuve Clicquot and smashed it right on that battleship Illinois. It's what I would do. So, while we had an active chapter of the WCTU, we also were considered, and still are, the second city. So we drew in a lot of tourists, including ladies of the Indiana WCTU. 1893, same year as the World's Fair, just put it into context. The women of the Indiana WCTU decided to come up and see the conditions for themselves in our levee. If you're wondering what the levee is, I have a map. That was our South Side red light district. If you want to learn more about the levee, Will Quam spoke about it this year during his disgusting and dangerous tourism talk, which is available on our YouTube. Never miss a chance to market, folks. Anyway, so they decide they're going to come up and see this for themselves, but with a police escort. Now, over the course of several evenings in October, they traversed most of the levee and, to their surprise, were welcomed into the brothels and the saloons, and were able to see firsthand their living conditions and talk to folks that were making their living there. Now, reading this article for me was a little interesting because the main point that the Indiana WCTU women made was that they were so scandalized by the young age of the men visiting the red light district. 15, some as young as 15, most were 19 to 21. Oh, those poor men. This is where I get mad. The secondary scandal, that was like paragraphs down. Oh, these women working in these brothels, they didn't want to be here. They were able to talk to the women, and the madams and men running it were very open, like, yeah, ask them why they're here. And every woman they talked to said, I came to Chicago because I heard there was work. I'm from the country. You know, I didn't know much about the city, but I knew there were good jobs here, and at home there was no job for me. So I came here, only to find that this was the only job. This is the last resort. I didn't want to be here. This is where I am, though. The WCTU ladies said, wow, such nice, refined country girls. What a shame. One member was quoted saying, not a house was visited in which liquor was not freely dispensed. Furthermore, nearly all of the girls smoked cigarettes. These facts are of great importance to our crusade against strong drink and tobacco, for they show that the use of them might either lead to fearful results. They're saying that these women got here because they drank and smoked. In no place did they mention the lack of jobs for women. I have to calm down. So that was what they took away. When asked why the women came up to the levee, WCTU women, they said, quote, is entirely a personal matter. Aside from seeing the sights, saying some prayers with the working girls, which was very much appreciated and a source of comfort, they had no plan to provide resources to help women exit to other employment opportunities, and in no way plan to come back and support the community. They were purely there to sightsee and to gather horror stories to bring back to their local communities. Say, hey, country girl who knows nothing, you want to go to the big city? They have alcohol and cigarettes and they'll make you a whore. Not effective. Anyway. That wasn't the only march on the levee, though. We're going fast forward 9-ish years, 1907. Now, remember the women's crusade that I talked about where they're singing Nearer My God to Thee, making everyone cry, and everyone shuts down their saloons and everyone's happy? Yeah, so they tried that here in 1907. It was the summertime, and the WCTU ladies started their morning off by greeting the workers of Illinois Steel Company right as they're coming off their night shift. These guys are carrying their pails with the beer they drank during their shift. All of a sudden, they're coming out in the bright light of day. They just want to, go have another drink and go home. Anyway, instead, they got a bunch of ladies there singing more hymns. Now, they were great singers, and, they didn't have iPods back then. There was no Spotify. Some ladies singing some hymns was a welcome source of entertainment. They cheered. Some gentlemen even, got teary-eyed and put their beer pails down. Not too many, but one or two. So, success. Anyway. Then they kick off their afternoon in the depths of the levee, and they're walking up and down, they're singing their songs, and they're once again welcomed into the brothels and the saloons. Now, these are the Chicago WCTU folks. They're a little bit more aware of what's going on than the Indiana gals that came up 10 years before this. So they did bring some younger members with them, a 13 and 14-year-old girl, and they would sing this lovely duet. Now, here's the thing. Some of the saloon keepers weren't down with minors coming into their saloon who weren't sex workers. One brothel, well, they said resort keeper, but I think that means brothel. He said, quote, "There's enough of them little ones already on the road without bringing them good girls into this hole." Honestly, I get it. No one wants to see minors in that situation, whether or not they're working or there for charity. So, that's not where the day ends, though, because in the evening, the church groups that had accompanied the WCTU ladies in the day stayed in the levee. The WCTU ladies, they went home, they went back to their dinners and their, mansions on the north side. But the church groups stayed and were much more forward with confronting the folks that were in the levee to sin. So there was some talk about how aggressive they were and were really pounded down the door saying, "Stop." But then there were a few younger members, some young men who they realized later didn't actually make it home. It was their first time in the levee. They decided to stay and try it out. Whoops, you win some, you lose some. Man. I love vintage gossip. Honestly, if you ever need entertainment for like a Saturday night and you're staying home, Chicago Public Library has all the old Chicago Daily Tribunes. You put in your library card, you can read full name and address of anything bad that ever happened to anybody. It's amazing. All right, this is one of my favorites. 1909. Mrs. Mary Rose Burns, a music teacher at the Fine Arts Building, is brought to court by the mother of John Beers. Yeah, it's spelled as you think. Now, according to John Beers, he had proposed to Mary Rose on a beautiful August day in 1905 in Michigan. Romantic. But if you ask Mary Rose, that's not what happened at all. They were just friends, really, pen pals. They wrote letters to each other, and occasionally, they wrote letters to each other, and John Beers claimed that she invited him to lay his head on her lap and kiss him. Not true. Didn't happen, according to Mary Rose. Now, the judge read the letters and said, quote, "There is nothing in these letters to show that any such intimate relations existed between the parties in their suit. They are the sort of letters that any good woman might write and are full of good advice to a man whom I should judge from the tenor of them to be addicted to the drink habit." Oh, the irony of having the last name Beers, but also not being cool with the alcohol. It's really unfortunate. Anyway, John Beers' mother brought this case to court because her son had given Mary Rose an engagement ring and a gold bracelet that came to the cost of $170. In today's money, that's $6,000. I know, the vapors. Anyway, so John Beers says, the ring and the bracelet, that was, how did he say it? It was under the understanding that the gifts were to celebrate their engagement. They had an understanding, folks. Mary Rose had no such understanding. She claims she was never engaged to John Beers, and that he, in fact, gave her the ring, the bracelet, and 2 brass lockets as a token of their friendship. To all my friends in the room, thank you for coming. I'm sorry, I do not have brass lockets for you tonight. Please forgive me. Anyway, the quote from Mary Rose from court says, "John said that he gave me the lockets as a token of his esteem and gratitude for what I had done for him. His parents asked me to induce him to stop drinking, and I tried. Finally, I said that I could not go out with him anymore, as I did not think he was a fit person to be seen in public with. My sentiment for Mr. Beers was purely of a WCTU nature." The judge did rule in Mary Rose's favor. as Patty mentioned, we were on WGN, Spotlight Chicago. You can find the link on our Instagram and Facebook, and also on their Instagram and Facebook. It was a great experience. We had the opportunity to talk a bit about our organization, this winter lecture series, and to my surprise, I got to tell 2 stories. I was told first it was only one. So this is one of the stories that I mentioned on WGN, but much more detail for the lovely people that trekked out here tonight in person and watching the recording at home. Now, it's 1932. It's the last year of Prohibition, all right, folks? We're near the end. We're light at the end of the tunnel, except then president of the Chicago WCTU, Mrs. Beta Brewster, was not thrilled. She needed to hire somebody to create some propaganda for her organization and to continue promoting prohibition and temperance. This is where her son's friend, Arthur Lynch, comes in. He was a local press agent, and he also had a drinking problem. Mrs. Beta Brewster chose to hire Arthur in the hopes that creating materials to promote prohibition would encourage him to dry out. Now, during this time, Arthur was having marital troubles with his wife, Mrs. Amelia Bourg, who ran a French nursery out of their house on Elm Street. Now, due to his frequent benders, Amelia had kicked Arthur out of their home, but luckily, his employer, Mrs. Beta Brewster, jumped into the rescue and helped get him a room at a local men's shelter and would periodically bring him food. Very nice of her, very nice. So that's why on Christmas Eve of 1932, Beta Brewster was bringing food to Arthur, but he seemed out of sorts. Something to note about our friend, Mrs. Beta Brewster, she had never touched alcohol. Her parents didn't drink, her husband didn't drink, so it took her a minute to put the puzzle pieces together and realize Arthur was super drunk. Now, she had heard the way you sober someone up is you put him to bed and you give him black coffee. No one had told her that's an either-or situation. So she was very confused why, after pouring a ton of black coffee down his throat and putting him to bed, Arthur kept jumping out and saying, "Come on, Beta, let's go make whoopee." They use that direct word, and I don't know what it means, and I didn't want to Google it. I assume it's something scandalous. Maybe, I don't know, it's 1932. Probably involved exposed knees. Crazy. Anyway, Mrs. Beta Brewster, despite Arthur's drunken ways, stayed with him until 1:30 a.m. when he had calmed down and finally gone to bed. She was seen leaving his residence at 1:30 a.m. on Christmas Day. Now, because Arthur's wife, Amelia, had heard Beta had been with her husband until 1:30 a.m. in a room that Beta had paid for, she took Beta to court and said she would crush her like the snake she was for trying to steal her husband away. It's rough. So Mrs. Beta told her story, much like I just did, to the judge. She also added that she's at least 10 years older than Arthur, and he's a friend of her son's. Of course, nothing happened. Well, sadly, that case did not end well for Mrs. Beta Brewster, because she had to pay a fine and step down as president of the Chicago WCTU. Crazy. But it's even worse for Amelia and Arthur, because 4 years later, 1936, they were found dead in their home at 43 East Elm Street. It's still standing today. It's on our Gold Coast walking tour. Come this summer and see it in person. Anyway, at first glance, the verdict was that the couple had died of chloroform fumes, an apparent suicide pact. Well, there was a note left by Amelia. She said, quote, "We decided to die, and he is gone, and I'm still alive. I am what I was afraid of, going now, E." Very sad. So, due to Arthur's frequent drinking sprees, and that he'd left his wife on several occasions for other women, which may or may not have included Mrs. Beta Brewster, police came to the conclusion that Amelia decided on death for them both. I know. So, When Patty sends around the call for, hey, do you want to be a speaker? Tell us about what scandal you want to talk about. I immediately could only think of one, and therefore built this whole talk around this one scandal. I hope you like it. The Fountain Girl. She was commissioned by the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1893 for the Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair, to promote cleaning pure, clear water instead of alcohol. It was part of a global campaign to get folks to hydrate instead of imbibe, and this campaign induced 350,000 children around the world to sign pledges that they would never drink alcohol. There was no follow-up. Who knows? Anyway, so this fountain depicts a little girl made of brass and a stone base. To raise the funds to create this fountain, local Chicagoland area children donated nickels and pennies and ultimately got up to the $3,000 needed to create the statue. English artist George Wade designed the statue, and it is also known as Little Cold Water Girl and the Francis Willard Fountain. The chalice she's holding, you see the chalice? Yeah, amazing. It looks like the Loyal Temperance Union badge. Now, like I said, this fountain was at the fair. It was in front of the WCTU booth and was used by people to drink water instead of alcohol. It was also used by the horses and the dogs and the birds. Germ theory was pretty new at that time, but not new enough where this wasn't cool. Anyway, thank you, Lisa. After the fair, the fountain was moved to the Women's Temple, where you can see it in the larger picture here. That's on the Monroe. The temple was at LaSalle and Monroe, and this is the Monroe side. And the entrance right behind her would have led straight to the Willard Auditorium. Again, providing clean water for the people, the horses, the dogs, and the birds. Now, after the Women's Temple was cruelly taken away from us, deconstructed for a soulless box, our little fountain girl moved up to Lincoln Park. She now sits in the southern end near the Chicago History Museum. She's oscillated around there a bit, depending on where the Lakeshore Drive project was at the time, but that's where she's been. That was until one cold, scary night in the 1950s, she disappeared. Gone, without a trace. Our sweet, darling little girl who's made of bronze and maybe was sold for scrap metal, we don't know. So it wasn't until 2012 that we got a new little fountain girl. So the one you see today is not the one you can see in the photos here. She's a replica. The original little fountain girl had been copied in New York and London, England, and also Portland, Maine. Portland, Maine provided theirs for an example, so we could have ours recreated. And this fund was championed by local philanthropist Jeanette Van Nies. Now, Little Fountain Girl is a beloved icon in my neighborhood. I would not be surprised if she had a little shamrock on her this Saturday. She had her own mask during the COVID lockdowns of 2020. The reason why I tell this story is this, folks. Chicago is the biggest small town we will ever live in. One of you, one of us, we know what happened to her. If you were here in the 1950s and your weird friend, suddenly got really rich from selling bronze statue, or maybe your cousin was here and he was a prankster. Who knows? I want you to go home, check your attics, check your basements, check your storage units. We want her back. If you find her, I don't know what you do then. I'm not thinking ahead that much, but we want her back. So with that, thank you for joining me for my historical tea session. I hope you learned something, and if you have any questions, let me hear them.